Welcome to Books in the World, brought to you by Cape Cod Writers Center, helping writers for over 50 years. I am Pamela Kirinali, known as Q, and our guest today is Jessica Keener. Jessica is the author of the national best-selling debut novel Night Swim and a collection of award-winning stories, Women in Bed. Her newest novel, Strangers in Budapest, was published to wide acclaim. It was chosen as an Indie Next Pick and a Best New Book by Entertainment Weekly, Simple.com, and January Magazine. This past summer, Boston Magazine selected Strangers in Budapest as one of 7 beach reads by New Englanders. The Jewish Book Council called Strangers in Budapest an emotional, unpredictable, and often riveting story. Keener is the recipient of a Massachusetts Cultural Council Artist Grant and has been listed in the Pushcart Prize under Outstanding Writers. She has taught literature and writing at Boston University, Brown University, University of Miami, and Grub Street, and has written more than 100 feature articles for national magazines such as the Boston Globe, O, the Oprah Magazine, and Design New England. As a child, she spent 2 months at overnight camp in East Brewster and learned to sail on Cape Cod Bay. Today, she lives in Brookline, where she and her husband raised their now 25-year-old son. Jessica's latest book, as I alluded to, is The Strangers in Budapest. Boston Magazine further said, with chills lurking around each corner, this second novel by author Jessica Keener is the perfect page-turner for late autumn. And B.A. Shapiro, the New York Times bestselling author of The Muralist and The Art Forger, says, a provocative novel about the power of the past and our interpretations and misinterpretations of it to haunt the present. A wonderful book. Congratulations, Jessica.
Thank you.
Now, tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, it's great to be here, great to be on the Cape, which is definitely part of my DNA. As I mentioned, I grew up here for 8 summers. In East Brewster, I went to Camp Wono. It's now the Sea Camp, but it was all-girl Camp Wono. So I did learn how to sail and swim and archery, and I went every summer for 8 summers for 2 months, which I don't think is a typical experience anymore for kids.
No.
But,
yeah.
And it worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if summer camp works for you, it's great, and it did work for me. It was just such a special experience to be with the pine trees and learning how to swim on the bay when the tides go out, and our day rotated around the tide. So when it was a high tide, that's when we had our swimming period. So it's just a very special place to me, and I'm glad to be here.
So it must feel a little like coming back home when you
Always
come to the Cape.
Always. And then
Yes.
my parents lived here for many years too, in Centerville.
Oh, in Centerville.
Yep. So I kept coming back and visiting them, and they're not here anymore, but so it continued.
Good.
Yeah.
Now, tell us a little bit about your travels to Budapest and what led you there.
Well, so I married someone from the South, and for a while we were living in Florida, in Miami, and I really had never done a lot of traveling at all overseas, and neither had my husband. So we had started to every year go visit some city in Europe, you know, the first time Paris, Madrid, the major cities, Rome. And while we were living in Miami, this was back in the late 1980s, we were talking, this was a time when just around 1990-ish, 92 or so, people were starting to talk about Eastern Europe and Budapest and Hungary, and the Russians had just left right around mid-1990s, and the Western world was just pouring in, and America is very much trend-oriented, and there are fads, and so it was sort of a fad, I think, for a lot of people to go over to East Europe and look behind the Iron Curtain and see what was there. It was different. It was like stepping back in time, absolutely. So while we were living in Miami, we lived in Coral Gables, and our friend said, you should go over with George, who's Hungarian American, and he still has family over there, and he goes over there a lot, and you should go with him because he speaks fluent Hungarian. And we met George, and we decided to go over with him. So we went just like we have been traveling in other times. We went for a week or so, and we went to Budapest with George, and it was just amazing. I think part of it was that I had been living in Florida, and I grew up in Newton, and then I went to school in New England. I was at BU, I was at Brown, very much a New England girl. So to live in Florida, where everything is bright sun and old Spanish architecture and everything is flat, it was exciting to be back sort of in an old European city. It reminded me, you know, sort of my roots of Boston. And so we were there with George, and he took us all around the city, and we visited his cousins, and because he spoke fluent Hungarian, we could really go to places that we would not have been able to go to if we had just gone over as tourists and just done the typical tourist thing. So it made it feel very special for that reason too. We went to his cousin's house in the south, and they served us the goulash, which was so different than my expectation, because always in the cookbooks and the goulash that I had made in college, you know, there was always a pint of sour cream, and it was thick, and it wasn't that way at all. It was a thin soup, and it was very sort of a potent beef stock, and some vegetables and some little noodles, and it was delicious. And I remember I was at the cousin's house remarking on how good the soup was, and the son who was there was just like, you know, I eat this every day. This is nothing special. So I kind of remember that.
It was very interesting how throughout the book you make ties and references to the food, and that your heroine in the book calls it out by the Hungarian name, and we often can figure out or get an explanation of what it is, the food and the drink, and that added a little bit of spice, no pun intended, to the book. But let me ask you, how did you've sort of made allusions to Boston comparisons and to Budapest, as far as the city, the setting, and a proximity to a larger another city of a different nature. How did Budapest compare?
So going over there, and because I had been living away from home, from Boston, when I say home, would be Boston, it struck me very strongly. Budapest, they have the trolley system, the above ground trolley system. I don't know if you've been there, but they have the Duna, is what they call it, which is the Danube, running in the middle of the city, which is like the Charles River in Boston, which divides Cambridge and Boston. Budapest used to be actually the three cities. There was a third little city, but Buda was the hills, and Pest was the flat industrial side of Budapest, and then the river in between, which they're now joined by so many bridges. And so there was that, and of course just being an old European city, just the architecture was very familiar. I don't know if a lot of the buildings were 1920s or something. I think just again the sort of grittiness of an old city like Boston. Boston's gotten a lot more polished in more recent years, and this is back when I was again living in Miami. So I had a certain nostalgia for that old European city, and it's yet at the same time it's walkable. It's a very approachable city, and it's gorgeous at night. It's magical at night.
It seems to be. It seems to be. So then, did you make a second mini vacation prior to your actual trip of living there?
So what happened was, on our last day of being there, the first time, and we were staying in some hotel, and the other thing, I know this is sort of crazy, but it was so inexpensive. It felt almost criminal, the difference between America and Budapest at the time, and staying in a nice hotel and having room service and having the whole 5-course meal for $15 or something crazy. But I was taking kind of a last walk around the neighborhood of where we were on the Pest side in the hotel, and I passed this kiosk that had a painting on it, or a picture of a painting, poster, and I was sort of taken by the picture. It was a picture of a man and women running, and kind of modern looking. And then I kept walking, and then there was the studio, and there was I caught sight of the picture, the painting, the real one, in the gallery. It was a showing, and I walked in, and I really loved the paintings, and the artist was there, and he spoke English, and so we started to talk. His name is Lotzi, and he was showing me around the paintings. My husband and I, we love art, and had always had the idea of buying original art. So I thought, well, this is a great opportunity. It was affordable, and I really loved it. And the painting that I'd seen on this poster had been sold. So I called up my husband to come over, and we were sort of looking at all the paintings, and we actually bought one. And we were so excited. So what we did was we ran to some bank to get the forints, to exchange the money, the American money, into forints to give to the artist. And we ran back to give Lotzi the forints, and his whole face dropped, because what he had really wanted was the American dollars at the time. This is in the mid-1990s. So that was a half payment. So we sent the second payment in American dollars to him. It's kind of just an aside, not that important. But the thing is, we fell in love with his painting, and at the time, I think we actually took it home with us on the plane. And it was a pretty good sized painting. I don't think we could do that now. And Lotzi said to us, you have to come back and stay with me next time. So we did. We returned and stayed with him in his apartment for a week. And there was something about just staying with Lotzi, a real Hungarian who was living there. He was a working artist. He'd won some top prizes in Hungary and had shown in salons in Paris and things. And he worked at a gallery. And I kind of followed, so we sort of shadowed his lifestyle and went to some gallery openings and ate at the restaurants he ate at. And we kind of walked out one day and said, wow, we'd always had this dream of living overseas. We'd traveled enough at that point to want to know the difference between traveling through for 2 weeks and actually living someplace. And so we thought, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe this is where we should try it out. And I think also just living in his apartment just made the everyday life seem very possible. It didn't seem strange. You start to realize people aren't so different, even though the culture could seem like it's very different. I didn't know the language. Lotzi woke up in the morning and made his coffee and had his breakfast, and then went out, to his job during the day in the city and hung out with his friends and drank wine at night. So how different is that? Yeah.
So was it nearly a decade later that you,
no,
how does
actually,
this fit in the time frame when you moved
it was just
there?
actually, I think maybe even the following year.
Oh, you moved with your husband?
We decided, and our infant child. We just thought, now's the time. I don't know if partly it was having a baby. Sometimes it makes you more aware of time or something. There was some urgency. Why wait? Some people, like I said I did say in the novel, why go now or something, or with the baby. But our thinking was, the baby doesn't care. The baby just wants to be with the parents, and we didn't have to worry about schools or anything like that. Right. And my husband was wanting to explore some business opportunities in the phone business. So, because it was mid-1990s, because the Russians had just left and Hungary had been under communist rule for 50 years, it really was walking back in time. It was a 1950s time capsule. People did not have phones. People who did have phones had waited 5 to 10 years to get a phone, a landline, which is just impossible for an American mind to imagine. Like, who waits for things like that? Totally. So, railroad systems were backwards. Everyone did have a satellite dish, which is kind of interesting. So everybody had 1 million TV stations. And I sort of remember, so we decided to go. We just kind of made a decision, we're going to go. And
so we see that some of your personal life is in this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always do like to harvest, or I don't know if I like to, but I do always end up harvesting something from my personal experience. It just seems to be the way I work, and then from there it always has to become fiction and not related to me at all. Although I think every author, you know, there's something personal to whatever any author writes, but so we went and lived there for a year, and that was it. It turned out to be a great experience and also a hard experience, because it's very different to live someplace as opposed to, you know, visiting for 2 weeks.
So now we have the characters Annie and Will,
Yeah.
who were probably inspired by yourself and your husband.
Yeah, a little bit.
And Will is there to start up a business
Right.
and explore the opportunities. And they meet this cast of characters. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of them, or?
Yeah, so I was, maybe what I should tell you a little bit is what
Yes.
led me to, or what inspired me to pick Budapest ultimately, because I didn't write this book. We lived there for a year, and then we moved back to Boston, actually. I wanted to be closer to family and all that, but so I didn't actually write this book until, I don't know, at least maybe almost 15 years later. And I've not been back to Budapest since the time I've lived there, and there was an advantage for me for that, in terms of creating a setting at that time period and not being influenced by all the changes that have occurred now. And
Right.
it's certainly not the same place that it was when I was there in the mid-1990s. So what I want to say is I came back from Hungary having lived in an unusual place, and when you live in a place for a year, you sort of steep in the culture, and you start to absorb the deeper layers of the culture. And in this case, for me, I really noticed there was a lot of depression, and the way they thought was just different. A lot of expectations that I had as an American, that things were possible. You know, people in Budapest or Hungarians would just think they had a common way of saying it was impossible. And that sort of struck me, and I kind of put that in the book. But I went back to Boston. I started freelancing for the Boston Globe in lots of different places. And in that process, I had written a feature article for the Globe about a young teenager who was living in Dorchester and was on his way to a Teens Against Gang Violence meeting, and unfortunately got caught in a gang crossfire and was killed. And then his mother, Tina Cherry, started the Louis B. Brown Peace Institute in his honor. And I wrote a feature story about that. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because I was thinking about how could this woman, you know, this is just the worst thing on earth, is to lose your child, and then to lose a child in this way. And she created this institute in his honor, and also to help other families who had been through, who had lost through violence. And she calls them survivors. And I just was fascinated, and I had trouble even understanding how she could find the strength to do that. So that was kind of sitting in me. And then at the same time, as a Jewish person, growing up Jewish, I grew up with a father who fought in World War II, a Jewish army man, and his division was part of the Rainbow Division, which helped to liberate Dachau. And so I grew up knowing that my father had done something like that and lived through that and seen that horror. And he even had a book in the house in the library that had pictures of the skeletons and all those horrors that I would look at those pictures as a child. And, you know, it was just, how do you understand something like that? It was impossible to understand. And so I think that was sort of sitting in me also. And then I did have this random conversation with a neighbor, and her daughter had died, and she kind of thought that there was something suspect about her death, and she kind of never really pursued it. And I wondered, I think that was a tipping point for me, and I just thought, what would I do in these circumstances? You know, this Tina and this neighbor, and then thinking about what my father had been through, and I just thought, I think I want to write about the extreme emotions that might take you to a point of murder or death or something, I wasn't sure when I was sitting down to write, but I wanted to take myself to, or imagine some extreme circumstance, and what would I do, and what would my character do? So I came up with Annie, and I thought Budapest would make a perfect setting for this, because living there for the year, I saw that all the buildings were pockmarked with bullet holes, and you see the remnants of war. It's in your face. Growing up in Boston, I certainly didn't see that, except for knowing that my father had experienced that, but otherwise very protected. And so I saw that in Budapest when I was living there, and I was wondering, like, how does that affect generations of people? They were always on the wrong side of the war, and then of course the horrors of the World War II in Hungary, the murders of the Jews on the river, that have now, it's been memorialized there, but it hadn't been when I was living there. All those things were tying together, and I sort of brought it together in this story.
And
so.
now we meet the character that Annie and Will were introduced
So Annie
to.
and Will comes a young couple,
Edward.
and goes over to Hungary. They're expats. They're going for adventure a little bit, and their neighbor back home says, "Can you please check on this older man? It's so hot there in the summer. He's not doing well. Just check on him, but don't tell him. Just keep it under wraps." So they go and find Edward in this apartment in Budapest, and they knock on the door, and Edward is just an irascible, irritable, unfiltered character, and he's a lot of fun to write. He's also deeply grieving. He's had 2 losses, his daughter and his wife, and he's sickly and probably near the end of his life, and really has nothing to lose. He's sort of living life wants to find out the truth about his daughter's death, and he's searching for the man he believes killed her. And Annie becomes entangled in his search. She doesn't, and so the novel becomes kind of a tango, a dance between Annie, really, who is kind of a floating character. Will is sort of off doing his business, and he's exploring business opportunities, so he's got sort of a structure to his day. And Annie, it turns out, is harboring her own family secrets, and she has kind of lived a life of trying to be normal, because the things that have happened in her family are not normal, and she's tried to sort of present herself as a normal person and helping other people, and she's a person who likes to help other people, and partly I think to keep the attention off of herself. So
she's driven and becomes involved unwittingly with Edward,
right,
and his plans to find the man that was married to his daughter.
Right, and she doesn't know that.
No.
And so the reader knows more about what's happening than Annie knows.
Yes.
But Edward and Annie sort of connect on some deeper level. There's something about Annie that reminds Edward of his daughter, who was also a helper. Always went for the tired, the poor, the weary, the fringe. And Annie is drawn to Edward because she can sense that he needs something, and that maybe she can help him, and it creates some kind of purpose for her. But he digs out what sort of she's been holding inside.
And then we meet these other characters who start to come in that are going to help the plot move along, like Bernardo, the investing American businessman that Will become involved with, and Bernardo's wife, and the assorted people that come along, the entourage with Bernardo, and the story starts to take off.
Yeah. Bernardo was fun to write too. He's sort of your more typical American who's coming in for opportunity, and he's out there and he's aggressive, and he's also provocative and sort of charming and I guess sexy in a way. Sort of just an opportunist. And I did see a lot of that when I was over there living there, of Americans sort of swooping in to sweet, undeveloped Hungary, and let's see what kind of opportunities we can come up with. Turns out it wasn't so easy for Americans to just swoop into their country and and walk away with all the millions that Americans like to do.
And then we meet Stephen, who may be harboring a different side to himself.
Yep.
That he becomes involved with Bernardo and Will and the idea of a business, and Annie has met him as well on the side, and
Right.
he will become a key character
Right.
in this as the story progresses. So fascinating how the story comes together. This was a book I personally could not put down, and I had literally no clue of which way it was going to go either until almost the end. It was such a riveting. It is a truly riveting book, and it's your character development is just incredible. How you develop them and their thoughts, and based on their experiences, like you say, the interpretation or misinterpretation of what happened, of history, and how they react on it. I think this book would make a phenomenal movie. It is just a real thought provoker with these characters and the things they're carrying, and between the two countries and seas. So I really enjoyed it, and I would agree with what the critics said. You cannot put it down. Yes.
Glad to hear that.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell us, since we're kind of coming to the end of this?
Oh, wow. Time goes quickly.
It does.
You're having fun. Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I guess I was interested in crossing those barriers and pushing the boundaries psychologically in terms of our own expectations, and also how our inner wounds and tragedies and traumas shape decisions that we make or don't make, and how that interacts with our environment. And I like to play with the two, the culture and the inner life.
Well, thank you again, Jessica. Strangers in Budapest was published by Algonquin Books. You can learn more about it on www.algonquin.com. You can learn much more about Jessica and her other publications and books on her own website, which is www.jessicakeener.com. And she says she loves to hear from people on Facebook and Instagram. You can find Strangers in Budapest in most bookstores, your local library, Amazon.com, and this is the latest. It has just come out in paperback. And when will that be available for
So that'll
people?
be coming out in October. Great for book clubs.
And it was referred as an indie pick.
Yes.
Tell
yes.
us about that.
So it was the hardcover was chosen as an Indie Next pick, which is a great honor because all the independent bookstores around the country make those selections. There's a list of 20, and then now this has also been an indie pick, new in paperback on that list, which will be coming out in November. Again, a very specialized list, so I feel very honored about that.
And well, thank you, Jessica. It's an honor to have someone as
you.
accomplished as yourself here today. And once again, I'm Pamela Kirinali with Books and the World.
Oh, thanks so much.